There is a real story here. In the late 2000s, a man named Andrew D. Basiago began publicly claiming that as a child, in the late 1960s and early 1970s, he had participated in a classified United States government program that experimented with teleportation and time travel. He called it Project Pegasus. He named institutions. He named locations. He described machines. Historians do not accept his account. Physicists do not accept his account. There is no verified evidence that any such program ever existed. But that is where the real story ends, and where tonight's story begins. What follows is fiction, a conspiracy thriller built on top of a rumour. None of it is verified. None of it should be taken as fact. It is a story to fall asleep to and nothing more. So turn the lights down. Let your eyes close whenever they want to, and come with me down a long concrete hallway in a building that officially does not exist in the winter of 1971. The boy is 9 years old and he is barefoot. That is the first thing anyone would notice about him, if anyone were looking. He stands in the middle of a corridor with a floor of polished grey concrete, and his feet are bare, and the cold of the floor is climbing up through his heels into his ankles, and he does not remember taking off his shoes. He does not remember arriving. He does not remember the room he was in before this one, or the day before this day, or the ride that brought him here, or the hands that must have guided him. He simply is here, the way a person simply is in a dream. The walls are smooth, not painted brick, not tile, not the cinder block of a school hallway. They are poured concrete, sanded down and sealed, and they curve very slightly, as if the corridor were carved through the inside of something enormous. There are no windows along their length. There are no doors that he can see. There is only the hallway, running forward into a white distance, lit from above by long fluorescent tubes that hum at a pitch just high enough to feel in the teeth. The air smells faintly of ozone. He does not know that word yet. He is 9. He only knows that the air smells the way the sky smells after lightning, sharp and clean and slightly metallic, and that it is a strange smell to find so far underground. Because he knows he is underground. He could not tell you how he knows. There are no signs. There is no elevator in sight. But the air is still in the way that only deep air is still, and the sound of his own breathing comes back to him from the walls a half-beat late. And somewhere far away, below him, something very large is running. He can feel it more than hear it. A low rhythmic pulse in the floor, like a heartbeat that belongs to the building. Men in white coats move past him. They come in ones and twos, walking quickly, carrying clipboards and folders and cardboard boxes of punch cards. They pass so close that he could reach out and touch their sleeves. They do not stop. They do not slow. And this is the part that will stay with him for the rest of his life. Longer than the machine, longer than the light, longer than any of the places they will send him. Not one of them looks at him. Not out of cruelty. He can tell the difference, even at 9. A cruel adult looks at you, and then looks away. These men do not look at all. They walk around him the way you would walk around a chair, their eyes fixed politely on the middle distance, and he understands, with the terrible clarity children sometimes have, that they have been told not to, that somewhere there is a rule about looking at him. He wants to say something. He opens his mouth and finds that his throat is dry and the words have gone somewhere he cannot reach, and what comes out instead is a small sound, barely a sound at all, and even that goes unanswered. So he turns his head and looks down the hallway instead. At the far end, mounted high on the wall where a clock would hang in a school gymnasium, there is a clock. It is an institutional clock. Black hands, white face, a thin red sweep hand ticking around the outside. The kind of clock that exists in every government building in the world. The kind that has watched over 10,000 boring afternoons. And the sight of it is so ordinary that it steadies him a little. A clock means time. Time means schedules. Schedules mean that someone somewhere knows what is supposed to happen next, and Eventually, what is supposed to happen next will be that somebody takes him home. He squints at it. It reads 3:17 in the afternoon. He holds on to that, 3:17. He repeats it in his head like a phone number, 3:17, 3:17, because it is the only fact he has, and a child with only one fact will hold it very tightly. Then the red sweep hand stops. It does not slow. It does not wind down. It simply stops, mid-arc, as if the whole world had taken a small breath and forgotten to let it out. The hum of the fluorescent tubes drops half an octave. The pulse in the floor stumbles, misses, catches again, and then the hands begin to spin backward. Nobody touches the clock. Nobody is anywhere near it. The minute hand sweeps counterclockwise, faster and faster, until it is a blur, and the hour hand follows it around, unhurried, patient, the way an hour hand always is, and the boy stands barefoot on the cold concrete and watches time run out of the clock like water out of a sink. The men in white coats do not stop walking. That is the detail he will never be able to explain to anyone. The clock on the wall is spinning backward, and the men keep walking past with their clipboards, and one of them is complaining quietly to another about a delayed shipment of vacuum tubes, and neither of them looks up because this has happened before. It has happened enough times that it has become part of the background of their working day. The boy turns away from the clock, and that is when he notices the window. It is small, perhaps the size of a dinner plate, set into the wall at adult height. Thick glass with a wire mesh embedded inside it. The kind of window that exists so that somebody can check whether the room beyond has caught fire. He has to go up on his toes. The concrete is cold under the balls of his feet. He presses his forehead against the glass and it is warm, warmer than it should be, and he looks through. He expects another laboratory. He expects white coats and equipment and cables and the tops of men's heads. What he sees is New York City. Not a photograph of New York. Not a screen. A window, opening onto morning air, 4 or 5 stories above a street, with pigeons wheeling past at eye level, and a haze of exhaust hanging blue over the intersections and the noise of traffic arriving faintly through the glass. He can see a delivery truck double parked. He can see a man in a hat crossing against the light. He can see laundry strung between 2 fire escapes and steam rising from a grate, and the whole enormous indifferent morning going about its business. And rising above it all, in the south, 2 towers, unfinished. He knows what they are because he has seen them on the news, standing in front of the television in his socks while his mother folded laundry behind him. He knows they are supposed to be the tallest buildings in the world, and in the window they are only partly built, raw steel above a certain floor, cranes perched on top of them like herons, the skeleton of the second one still climbing. He has seen them finished. He is certain of it. He remembers the picture in the newspaper. He stares at them for a long time. Long enough that his calves begin to ache from standing on his toes. Long enough that his breath fogs a small oval on the glass and clears again. Then a voice behind him says calmly, without any surprise at all, "Good." And then, this time he remembered. The boy turns around. There is no one in the hallway. Somewhere behind the walls, the low pulse of the building picks up its rhythm again, and far away at the end of the corridor the clock stops spinning and settles very gently, back onto 3:17 in the afternoon. Now let the hallway fade. Let the cold floor go. We're going to leave 1971 for a while, and travel forward to a house in a suburb in the present day, on an ordinary afternoon in early autumn, where a man is standing in a garage he no longer wants to be standing in. His name is Ethan Holloway. He is 42 years old, and 11 days ago his father died. The dying was not dramatic. That is worth saying, because so many stories like this begin with a suspicious accident, and this one does not. Ethan's father, Raymond Holloway, was 78, and he had been ill for 2 years, and at the end he simply stopped, the way an old clock stops quietly, between one afternoon and the next, with a crossword, half finished on the table beside him. Ethan had worked for 11 years as an intelligence analyst before leaving to write, which is to say that he had spent 11 years reading other people's documents, looking for the one sentence that did not belong. It is a particular skill, and it does not switch off. It follows you into your father's garage and it makes you read the labels on the boxes. Most of the boxes are ordinary. Christmas decorations, tax returns going back 3 decades, held together with rubber bands that have long since gone to powder, a box of his mother's paperbacks, a box of tools that Ethan will keep because he cannot bring himself not to. And then there is the package. It is not hidden. That will bother Ethan later when he thinks about it. It is not buried at the back or taped inside a wall or slipped under a floorboard. It is sitting on the workbench in plain sight, wrapped in brown paper, with his name written on the front in his father's careful engineer's handwriting, the letters as evenly spaced as if they had been laid out with a ruler. His father knew he would come. His father knew he would find it. His father had put it exactly where a son would look. Ethan sits down on an upturned crate and opens it. Inside there are Polaroids. There are perhaps 20 of them, held together with a paperclip that has left an orange bloom of rust on the top photograph. They show industrial interiors, badly lit, taken by someone who did not particularly care about composition. Concrete, cable runs, a doorway with a numbered plate, a group of men in short sleeves standing beside something enormous that has been cropped out of frame, so that all you can see is a curved metal surface running out of the picture on both sides. There are security badges, 3 of them, laminated, with his father's face at 3 different ages, each one younger than Ethan remembers him ever being. Each badge is issued by a different contractor. Each carries a different photograph and the same name. The clearance markings on the 3rd badge are printed in a colour Ethan has never seen on a badge before. There are engineering sketches, dozens of pages drawn in pencil on graph paper, the line work beautiful and exact. Field geometries, cooling loops, something that looks like a bearing assembly for a ring far too large to be any bearing Ethan has ever heard of. Along the margins, in his father's handwriting, are notes about tolerances and thermal expansion, and one line, underlined twice, that reads, "It does not care which direction we run it." And at the bottom of the box there is a videotape, a VHS cassette, the plastic gone the colour of weak tea, the label typed on an actual typewriter, the letters slightly uneven where the ribbon had begun to fade. It says, Pegasus, Child Group 3. Ethan sits in his dead father's garage with the tape in his hands, and for a long moment he does not feel anything at all except a mild, tired confusion. Because he knows what his father did for a living. His father built aircraft. His father spent 35 years as a structural and systems engineer for a classified aerospace contractor, and Ethan grew up in a house where certain questions simply were not asked, where his father would come home and say the day had been fine and nothing more, where the family understood that there was a locked room in the middle of the man they loved, and that they were never going to be let into it. Pegasus. It sounds like an aircraft. Everything in that world sounds like an aircraft. Everything is named after a bird or a Greek monster or a weather condition. Child Group 3 sounds like nothing at all. It takes him 9 days to find a machine that will play it. He finds one eventually in a thrift store 2 towns over, a combination unit with a screen the size of a dinner plate, and he pays $18 for it and carries it out to his car under one arm, and he sets it up that night on his kitchen table with all the lights off, because some instinct he does not examine tells him he does not want to see his own reflection in the glass. The tape hisses, the tracking wanders and settles. There is no title card, there is no music, there is no narration, there is only a room. The room is large and white and windowless. The camera is fixed, mounted high in a corner, and it does not move for the entire recording. In the middle of the frame, arranged in 5 neat rows on the floor, sitting, cross-legged, are children. Ethan counts them. He counts them 3 times because he keeps losing his place. There are 31. They are between 7 and 12 years old. They are ordinary American children of the early 1970s, with home haircuts and gap teeth, and the slightly startled look children have in photographs from that era. They are not cadets. There is no uniform in the military sense, no insignia, no rank. They wear identical grey coveralls with a small stitched number over the left breast, and the coveralls do not fit any of them properly, because coveralls are made for adults, and these were cut down by someone in a hurry. They sit very still. That is the first thing that is wrong. Ethan has been a child and he has had children, and he knows that 31 children in a room is not a still thing. 31 children in a room is weather. It moves. It generates noise the way a fire generates heat. These children sit with their hands in their laps and they do not move. Occasionally one of them will turn and look at the door. The audio is poor. There is a constant low roar, the sound of the room's ventilation, and under it the murmur of adults somewhere behind the camera. Fragments come through. A man saying the word baseline. A woman reading out a series of numbers. Somebody laughing at something briefly and then stopping. And then, near the end of the second reel, a small voice cuts through all of it. High and clear and entirely reasonable. The voice of a child asking a question in a classroom. "Can I go home now?" Nobody answers. The murmuring continues. The numbers continue. The ventilation roars. Perhaps 4 minutes later, the same voice again. The same words. The same tone. Exactly as reasonable. Exactly as patient. "Can I go home now?" Nobody answers. Ethan watches until the tape runs out and turns to static. And then he sits in his kitchen in the dark with the light of the static on his face. And he understands that he is not going to be able to put this back in the box. The next morning he starts pulling threads. He is good at this. It is, in the end, the only thing he was ever truly good at. He knows which archives digitize their finding aids and which ones do not. He knows that the most useful document is almost never the classified one. It is the boring one that sits next to it. The requisition form, the travel voucher, the memo about parking permits. Secrecy protects the centre of a thing. It almost never protects the edges. If you want to find something that was hidden, do not look for it. Look for the shape of the hole it left in the paperwork around it. And there is a hole. Over the following weeks he assembles it, piece by piece, out of nothing but public material. A line item in a 1968 appropriations document, funded with no named program attached. A university physics department that received an unusual grant for 3 consecutive years and then abruptly stopped publishing. A general services contract for the installation of high-capacity electrical service to a facility whose address, when Ethan looks it up, is a stretch of desert with no facility on it. A memo about the transfer of 19 employees from one directorate to another, in which the receiving directorate does not appear on any organisational chart before or after that year. And on a form buried in a digitised records collection at a state university, an application for a bus charter, dated the spring of 1970, for transport of 34 minor passengers from 3 named school districts to a location listed only as Government Educational Facility, site to be provided by sponsor. 34 children, sent somewhere, by bus, with the destination left blank. Ethan looks at that form for a long time. Then he goes back to the beginning and starts asking the question that will occupy him for the rest of the year. Why children? The answer, when he finally finds it, is worse than he expects. It comes from a source he does not expect either, a 60-page internal review that was declassified in the 1990s as part of an entirely unrelated batch, redacted so heavily that most pages are more black than white, and passed over by every researcher who ever requested the box because on the surface it appears to concern industrial safety. In a sense it does. The review concerns adverse outcomes among adult volunteers in an unnamed experimental program. Between 1966 and 1969, the adults did not do well. Of the first cohort, more than half experienced seizures within 72 hours. A third suffered retrograde memory loss severe enough that they could not reliably state their own address. Several developed what the report describes, in the flat clinical language of the era, as persistent perceptual disturbances with paranoid features, which is a long way of saying that they came back from wherever they had been, and they were never entirely convinced that they had come back at all. 2 men suffered cardiovascular collapse within minutes of the procedure. One of them did not survive it. The report includes a table. Ethan stares at the table for a long time. The table correlates adverse outcome severity against age, not against dosage, not against duration, not against equipment configuration or field strength, or any of the dozen variables an engineer would expect, against age. And the correlation is beautiful, in the way that a real finding is beautiful and a fabricated one never is. It is a smooth curve. The older the subject, the worse the outcome. Not a threshold, not a cliff, just a steady, remorseless, entirely unambiguous slope, running down from the oldest volunteers in their 50s to the youngest in their early 20s, and continuing in a dotted line below the edge of the data. Somebody, at some point in 1969, sat in a room and looked at that dotted line and extended it in their mind and understood exactly what it implied. The developing brain is not a finished thing. It is a thing in the middle of being built. It rewrites itself constantly. It holds contradictory information without distress, because contradictory information is its ordinary daily diet. Show an adult 2 versions of the same afternoon and something in him tears. Show a child 2 versions of the same afternoon and he will simply file them both and go outside to play. Whatever the machine did to a person, it did it to the parts of a mind that are already fixed. And in a child, almost nothing is fixed yet. The younger the participant, the higher the survival rate. That is the entire justification. That is the whole of it. Somewhere in a windowless room, a group of extremely intelligent men worked out that the experiment was survivable, and then worked out precisely who it was survivable by, and then did what people in windowless rooms have always done, which is to write a memo and route it upward and receive approval and begin. Ethan closes the document. He thinks about 31 children sitting cross-legged on a white floor, waiting for someone to answer a question. Let yourself sink a little deeper now. We're going to go back again, back to the end of the 1960s, and watch a machine get built. It does not begin as a time machine. Nothing ever begins as the thing it becomes. It begins as a program about moving objects. That is all. In the middle of the 1960s, in a defense research culture flush with money and utterly convinced of its own destiny, a small compartmentalized effort was funded to investigate whether an object could be displaced from one location to another without traversing the space between. The interest was entirely practical. If you can move a thing without crossing the distance, then distance stops mattering. And if distance stops mattering, then oceans stop mattering. And if oceans stop mattering, then a very great deal of the last 4,000 years of military history quietly becomes obsolete. The work is spread across at least 4 separate funding streams, none of which know about the others. This is deliberate. It is how the era did business. A physicist at university receives money to study one narrow question about field geometry, and never learns why anyone wants to know. A contractor builds an enormous cryogenic assembly to a specification, and never learns what will be put inside it. A machine shop in a small town turns out a series of very precise curved segments, and the men who make them go home to their families and say the day was fine. Nobody has the whole picture. That is the point. The whole picture exists in perhaps 9 minds. The research they draw on is a strange inheritance. Quantum field theory, still young then, still argued over. High-energy electromagnetics, which the era understood far better than the public imagined. Classified aerospace work on materials and vacuum. And in the deepest part of the archive, wartime research recovered at the end of the Second World War and translated slowly over the following decade. Folders of it, most of it worthless, some of it not, and a few pages of it strange enough that they had been quietly reclassified upward twice, and read by almost no one. The machine that emerges from all this does not look like a machine from a film. It has no dials, it has no lever, it is two rings, two enormous rotating rings, one nested inside the other, mounted on opposed axes so that when they run they sweep out a shape that the eye cannot quite hold. Between them, at the centre, is a circular platform of polished non-magnetic alloy, perhaps 3 meters across, with a shallow lip around the edge. When the rings are stationary, the whole thing looks like a piece of abandoned industrial art. When the rings begin to turn, the space at the centre of them stops looking like a place and starts looking like a suggestion. The engineers never call it a time machine. That phrase does not appear in a single document, not once, not in 30 years of paperwork, and Ethan will eventually come to understand that this was not modesty, it was procedure. The moment you write a phrase like that down, you have created a document that somebody someday will want to read aloud in front of a committee. So instead, in the memoranda, in the maintenance logs, in the budget justifications, it is only ever referred to by its designation. Temporal Phase Resonator 1. The first successful test is conducted in the winter, at night, because everything of consequence in that world happened at night. The test object is a steel sphere. It weighs a little under 2 kilograms. It is unremarkable in every possible way, chosen precisely because it is unremarkable, and it sits in the middle of the platform under the lights while 11 men watch from behind leaded glass. The rings spin up over the course of 40 minutes. The sound they make is not a whine. Everyone expects a whine. What they get is something lower, a slow beating pressure that arrives through the soles of the feet and settles in the chest. And one of the observers will later say that it felt less like standing near a machine, and more like standing near an animal that had been asleep for a very long time. At the moment of the test, the lights in the chamber do not flicker. Everyone expects them to flicker. They do not. Instead, for the duration of the event, they appear very slightly the wrong colour. The sphere disappears for 1.8 seconds. It does not fade. It does not shimmer. It is there, and then it is not there, and then it is there again. And the total duration of its absence is 1.8 seconds, measured by 3 independent instruments that agree with one another to 4 decimal places. For a moment nobody speaks. Somebody at the back of the room laughs. Once, the way people laugh when something enormous has happened and their body has not decided what to do about it yet. Then they go and retrieve the sphere. It is warm. That is the first anomaly, and it is the one they expected least. Its surface temperature is 11 degrees above ambient, and it takes almost an hour to cool. The second anomaly is a very faint discoloration around what they arbitrarily designate as its northern pole, a slight iridescence like oil on water that photographs badly and cannot be removed with solvent. The third anomaly takes 6 weeks to find, and it is the one that changes everything. The sphere is contaminated. Microscopically, faintly, but unmistakably. Embedded in the outermost few microns of its surface are particles of a radioisotope in a ratio that does not occur in nature, and does not match any weapons test in the historical record, and does not match any reactor output then in existence anywhere in the world. They spend 2 months trying to work out where it came from. The answer is that it came from a reactor design that will not be built for another 19 years. The sphere had gone somewhere. It had sat for 1.8 seconds in a place where that isotope was ordinary. It had picked up a thin film of a future the way a coat picks up smoke in a bar, and then it had come home, and it had brought the smell of that future back with it. You could hold it in your hand. Several of them did. Now here is where the story turns, and this is the part that the men in that room would spend the rest of their careers failing to explain to the people above them. Because the natural assumption, the assumption everyone makes, is that if you can reach the past, then you can change it. That is what the phrase time machine means to nearly everyone who has ever heard it. It means a lever. It means going back and killing the tyrant in his crib, or buying the stock, or saying the thing you should have said. Pegasus could not do that. Not because of a safeguard. not because of any rule imposed by anyone. It simply could not, in the way that a boat cannot climb a hill. Over the following 2 years, through several hundred instrumented tests, the physics team arrives at a conclusion that some of them will never emotionally accept. The machine does not create anything. It does not modify anything. It does not write. It can only read, and it can only read what is already there. Every timeline the machine reaches is a timeline that already exists. The image they settle on, the one that ends up in the internal briefing documents, is a river delta. Picture a river coming down out of the mountains as a single channel, and then reaching the flat country, and breaking again, and again, and again, until what was one river is 10,000 channels, braided together, separating and rejoining and separating again, all of them running to the same sea. History is not a line. History is a braid. And Pegasus does not steer the water. Pegasus is a small boat that can slip sideways from one channel into the next, which means that when a traveller goes back to 1938 and does something, they have not changed 1938. They have simply arrived in the channel where that thing was always going to be done. It was always there, waiting, one of an infinity of channels, and the machine found it and set them down in it. And when they come home, they do not come home, they come to the nearest available channel to home, which is very, very close, almost identical, almost. The first time the government truly understands what they have built is the first time it is used for observation, and this is where the children come in, because a camera cannot be sent. That was the second great disappointment. Instruments do not survive transit intact, or rather, they survive, but their recordings do not. And the reason for this occupies the physics team for years and is never fully resolved. A film camera returns with fogged film. A tape recorder returns with a tape of white noise. Every recording medium anyone tries comes back scrubbed clean, as if the transit itself were an eraser. Only one recording medium survives the journey reliably, a human memory. So the missions are observation missions and the observers are children, and the instructions given to them are simple enough that a 7-year-old can memorize them. Go where you are put, look at everything, touch nothing, speak to no one, come back and tell us what you saw. They are sent to ancient Rome, and they come back describing the smell before anything else, the smell of a city of 1 million people with no sewers to speak of, and one girl cries for 2 days and cannot say why. They are sent to a field in Pennsylvania in July of 1863, and they come back quiet. They are sent to stand at the edge of a desert in New Mexico before dawn on a morning in 1945 and told to face away from a certain direction and to close their eyes when they are told. And one boy does not close them fast enough, and for the rest of his life he will see a particular shade of white on the inside of his eyelids when he is tired. They are sent to watch rockets go up. Those are the good missions. Those are the ones the children ask for. Every mission is recorded afterward in a debriefing room with a table and 2 chairs and a reel-to-reel recorder by an adult whose job is to ask the same 14 questions in the same order every time and to write down the answers and never, under any circumstances, to react to them. And for a while, that is the entire program. Look, but do not touch. Until a boy named Daniel Reyes, aged 8, standing at the edge of a tree line in Pennsylvania on a hot afternoon, is spoken to by a soldier. The soldier is perhaps 19. He's sitting with his back against a fence rail and his face is grey with exhaustion, and he sees a small boy standing at the edge of the trees in strange clothes, and he does what any tired 19-year-old would do. He says something kind. He asks the boy if he is lost, and Daniel, who is 8, and who has been standing in the heat for 40 minutes, watching men die at a distance, and understanding almost none of it, says, "Yes." That is all he says. One word. The recovery is clean. Daniel comes home. The debriefing is unremarkable except for that one detail, which he volunteers immediately, because he is 8, and he knows he has broken a rule, and he wants to be told it is all right. 22 hours later, the archivist on duty notices that a paragraph in a reference book in the facility library has changed. Nothing important. a regimental designation. 2 letters different from what it said the previous week, and the archivist only notices because she had read that page 4 days earlier while eating lunch, and had thought at the time that the regiment had an unusual name. She checks 3 other copies of the same edition. All 3 now match the new version. She checks her own memory against her own notes, and her notes agree with her memory, and everything else in the world agrees with the book. She writes it up. She expects to be told she is mistaken. Instead, within a week, a new department is created. The physicists explain it, eventually, and their explanation is technically reassuring and emotionally unbearable. Nothing was changed. Daniel did not alter history. Daniel spoke to a soldier in a channel of the Braid, where a small boy always spoke to that soldier, and then the return transit brought the team back to the nearest available channel, and the nearest available channel to a world where that conversation happened is not quite the world they left. They did not change history. They moved, by an amount so small it could only be measured in the spelling of a regiment, but it could be measured. That was the thing. That was what frightened people once they understood it. Every single mission moved them. Every observation, no matter how careful, no matter how still the observer stood, no matter how completely they obeyed the instruction to touch nothing and say nothing, moved them sideways by some tiny amount, because the act of a person being somewhere is not nothing. Photons that would have continued now stop against a small back in a grey coverall. Air that would have been still is displaced by breathing. You cannot look at the world without touching it. That is not a rule of time travel. That is a rule of looking. And so the new department is formed, and it is given no operational function and no authority, and a very large filing system, and its entire responsibility is to maintain, continuously and obsessively, a record of what everyone remembers, so that after each jump it can be compared against what is now true. They keep encyclopedias in triplicate, sealed. They keep the daily newspaper. They keep transcripts of what staff members recall of their own childhoods, updated annually, because it turns out that the most sensitive instrument for detecting a shift in the Braid is a person's memory of their mother's kitchen. The staff of that department are known, throughout the programme, by one word: the archivists. They are not popular. Nobody likes the people whose job is to tell you that you are not quite in the world you were born in. Breathe out slowly. Let the story keep going without you holding on to it. If you drift now, that is exactly what is meant to happen. By 1972, the programme changes direction. It happens the way these things always happen, which is not by decision, but by drift. Somewhere above the physicists in a building far away, a man who has never seen the machine and never will is reading a summary of the summaries, and he notices something that nobody at the facility has thought to emphasise because they are too close to it. If the Braid runs in both directions, then the machine can look forward. The past is interesting. The past is confirmation. The past settles arguments among historians, and it makes for extraordinary reading. But the past cannot be used, and the entire apparatus that funds Pegasus exists for one purpose, which is to be used. The future can be used. So the mission profile is rewritten. The children are still sent backward, occasionally for calibration, because a known destination is the only way to verify that the machine is doing what it believes it is doing. But most of the missions now run the other way, out along the Braid into the years that have not arrived yet, and the instructions change. They are no longer told to watch a battle. They are told to read. Read the front page of a newspaper. Read the sign in the window of a bank. Read the labels in a grocery store. Look at what people are carrying in their hands. Look at what is being built and what is being torn down. Look at the flags. Count the flags. Come back and tell us everything. They're trained for months. They're drilled in memory technique until an 11-year-old can hold 400 digits in sequence and recite them backward. They're taught to sketch. They're taught in a way that would horrify any child psychologist who ever heard of it. To observe without reacting. To be a lens and not a person. And some of them learn this lesson so thoroughly that they never entirely unlearn it. And the reports start coming back. Some of them are useless. A great many of them are useless, in fact, and this is the part that never appears in any version of the story that gets told afterward. Most of what the children bring home is noise. A 12-year-old sent to a street corner in a city in the year 2004 returns with an exhaustive description of a shop selling telephones the size of a deck of cards, and nobody in 1972 can do anything at all with that except write it down. But some of it is not noise. A boy comes back from the late 1980s and describes, with the flat precision of someone reciting a spelling list, a wall in a European city coming down, and people standing on top of it in the dark hitting it with hammers. He does not know what the wall is. He is 9. He describes the hammers because he was told to describe what people were holding. A girl comes back from the middle, 1970s, having read 3 consecutive front pages, and the officials who receive her transcript hold a meeting about it that lasts 11 hours, and results in the transcript being removed from the general archive and placed in a safe to which 4 people have the combination. A boy returns from 2001 and cannot speak for a day and a half. They stop sending anyone to that year, and in a corridor on the 3rd sub-level they build the wall. It is not a dramatic thing to look at, it is corkboard, sheet after sheet of it, running the length of a corridor 40 metres long, and pinned to it, in chronological order by target year, are the observations, index cards, typed transcripts, sketches drawn in coloured pencil by children, because that is what was available in the debriefing room, and because a 9-year-old's coloured pencil drawing of an aircraft she saw parked at an airfield in a year that has not happened is technically an intelligence product. They call it the prediction wall. You could walk down that corridor and read the next 80 years, in fragments, out of order, in a child's handwriting. And here is the thing about a wall like that. It does not stay a curiosity. It cannot. A curiosity is something you look at, and something that useful stops being looked at very quickly and starts being used. It begins in small ways. A recommendation is quietly strengthened. A funding decision goes one way rather than the other. A negotiating position is held longer than it should reasonably be held, because someone at the table has read a card on a wall and knows how the other side's decade is going to go. Nobody is ever told where the information comes from. That is the beauty of it, from the point of view of the people running it. The product is delivered upward with a provenance marking that means, roughly, extremely reliable human source, and everybody who reads it assumes there is a man somewhere in a foreign capital risking his life, and behaves accordingly, which is to say, they believe it. For a period of years, decisions are made in the United States government on the basis of information gathered by children who had not yet started high school. And then the drift begins. Now this is the part of the story that I want you to be almost asleep for, because it is the part that will follow you if you are not. The archivists notice it first, which is their job, but the children notice it too, and the children notice it in a way that no filing system can capture, because what the children notice is happening inside them. They come back from a mission, and something in their own life is different. Not big things, never big things in the beginning. A boy comes back and his bedroom at home has a blue lampshade, and he is certain, absolutely certain, that it was green, and his mother laughs at him and tells him it has always been blue, and there are photographs, and the photographs agree with her. A girl comes back and her grandmother's name has an extra letter in it. A boy comes back, and the theme tune to a television programme has a different second line, and he sings the version he remembers to the other children, and 2 of them recognise it, and 4 of them do not, and one of them starts crying and cannot explain why. The staff call it drift at first, informally, and then, when it becomes a category on a form, they call it what it will be called for the rest of the programme's life. Memory drift. And it would be nothing. It would be an oddity, a psychological curiosity, the mind of a child under stress-producing false certainties, which is what the first psychological consultant concludes and puts in writing in 1971. Except that sometimes the evidence follows the memory. That is the sentence in the file that stops Ethan cold when he finally finds it decades later. Sometimes the evidence follows the memory. A document is retrieved from the sealed archive to settle an argument, and the sealed archive copy has the wording the child remembers, and the working copy in the office upstairs has the wording everybody else remembers, and both copies are genuine, and both copies have been in their respective safes untouched for 4 years, and there is no mechanism, none, by which either of them could have been altered. A photograph in a frame on a colonel's desk shows him standing on the left of a man he is certain he stood on the right of. A recording of a speech, played back, contains a sentence that 3 people in the room will swear was never in that speech, and it is in the recording, and it has always been in the recording, and there is only one recording. The physics team, when pressed, gives the only answer they have. They are not in the same channel of the braid that they started in. They never have been, not since the first mission. Every transit moves them a little. The moves are tiny, and they are cumulative, and there is no way back because there is no fixed point to come back to. The world they were born in is somewhere behind them in the delta, and they have been drifting sideways for years, one small correction at a time. Most people cannot detect it. Most people's memories are not precise enough. Memory is a story we retell ourselves, and a story bends easily. And a person who is shown evidence that contradicts their memory will, in almost every case, quietly rewrite the memory and never notice they have done it. That is not a flaw. That is a mercy. That is the only reason the drift is survivable at all. But the children were trained not to do that. The children were trained specifically and expensively to hold a memory exactly as it was recorded and to resist all pressure to revise it, because that was the entire point of using children as recording instruments. They were built into perfect witnesses, which meant they were the only people in the world who could feel the ground moving. You've heard the modern name for this, of course. Decades later, long after the program is gone, the general public will discover the phenomenon on its own, in the ordinary way, by arguing about it on the internet. A children's book series with a different letter in its title. A film that half the world remembers and that does not exist. A famous line from a famous film that nobody ever actually said. A man who died in prison in the 1980s, remembered vividly by millions of people, who in fact walked free and became a president. They will call it the Mandela effect. They will explain it correctly and reasonably as a quirk of collective memory, of suggestion, of the way human recall reconstructs rather than replays. And that explanation is almost certainly true. According to the conspiracy, it is also the cover story that the programme's own psychological staff drafted in 1974 and released into the world through academic channels, precisely because they knew what was coming. They knew the drift was cumulative. They knew that eventually the population at large would start to notice, and they knew that the safest thing you can possibly do with a true anomaly is to make sure that when people discover it, they already have a comfortable explanation waiting for them. Not a lie. Something better than a lie. A truth that is not quite the whole one. And then there is Lucas. Lucas Mercer is 10 years old when he enters the programme, and he is not the strongest of them, and he is not the bravest, and his memory tests are good but not the best in his group. He is a quiet, watchful, slightly undersized boy from a town in the Midwest whose father works for the railway, and his file is unremarkable in every respect except for one line, added by a psychologist in his 3rd month, which reads, "Subject appears to experience no distress on encountering contradictory recall." The others drift and it hurts them. The blue lampshade hurts. The extra letter in the grandmother's name hurts, in the particular way that only a small wrongness can hurt. The way a picture hung crooked in your own house will scratch at you all evening. Lucas simply keeps both. He remembers the green lampshade and the blue one. He remembers his grandmother's name spelled 2 ways, and later 3, and later 6. He remembers the television theme tune in every version it has ever had. He does not experience these as contradictions. He experiences them the way you experience knowing several people with the same first name. By the time he is 12, Lucas Mercer is carrying somewhere between 40 and 60 complete versions of his own childhood in his head, and he can tell you, without hesitation, which details belong to which. He becomes the most valuable instrument in the programme, because every other child is a camera that gets wiped between exposures. Lucas is the only one who can tell you what the picture looked like last time. They begin using him as the reference. After every mission by any child, Lucas is brought in and asked a series of questions about the world, ordinary questions, the capital of a state, the colour of a flag, the name of a bridge, and the differences between his answers and the current record become the measurement of how far they have moved. He is, in the most literal sense available, the only compass they have. And a compass, if you think about it for a moment, is a slightly frightening thing to be, because a compass does not get to go anywhere. A compass exists to tell other people where they are. There is one mission on the prediction wall that people stop walking past. It is card number 211. The target year is 2047. The location is Washington, in the District of Columbia, a specific intersection 11 blocks from the capital, chosen because it is a place where a great deal can be seen from a single standing position without moving. The observer is a girl called Ruth. She's 11. She's one of the best they have, methodical and unshakable, the kind of child who alphabetizes things for pleasure. The transit is clean. She's there for 19 minutes. And when she comes back, she does not say anything for a long time, and the debriefing officer, who has done this 200 times and knows better than to rush, sits with her in silence and waits. Here is what she eventually describes. The city is intact. That is the first thing she wants him to understand, and she says it several times in several different ways, because she can tell it is the thing he's going to get wrong. Nothing is broken. Nothing is burned. There is no rubble. The buildings are standing and the windows are unbroken, and the street is not cracked. The trees along the avenue are in leaf, and they have been pruned, and they have been pruned recently within the last year or two by somebody who knew how to prune a tree. The cars are parked neatly, not abandoned, parked, aligned with the curb, evenly spaced, wheels turned in the way that cars are parked by people who expect to come back for them. Traffic lights are working. She watches one full cycle, green, yellow, red, and back again, for a street with nothing on it. And there is almost nobody. Not nobody. That is the detail that keeps the officer awake for a week afterward. In 19 minutes she counts 4 people. 2 of them cross the far end of the street together quickly and go inside a building. One is a man in some kind of uniform standing in a doorway not doing anything in particular, who looks at her for perhaps 2 seconds and then looks away. And one is a woman at a 3rd floor window who does not open the window and who watches Ruth for the entire remaining 11 minutes of her stay. The woman at the window makes a gesture. Ruth cannot interpret it. She demonstrates it for the officer, and he writes down. Subject raised one hand flat, palm outward, held it, then pointed upward. Repeated 3 times. Ruth is asked what the weather was like. She says, "It was a nice day." She's asked whether the air smelled of anything. She says, "No, it smelled like nothing at all. It smelled cleaner than here." She's asked finally whether she has any conclusion, any impression, anything else at all she wants to say. And Ruth, who is 11 and who has been trained for 2 years to report and not to interpret, breaks protocol for the only time in her entire file. She takes the pencil and writes one sentence at the bottom of the form. Everyone was indoors because they said the sky was not safe. The officer asks her who said that. She says nobody said it. She says she just knew it, the way you know a room is cold before you touch anything. She says it was the shape of the whole day. That card stays on the wall for 11 years, and every person who works in that corridor stops in front of it at least once, and nobody ever manages to explain it, and no follow-up mission to that year is ever authorized, and by the middle of the 1980s the card has been read so many times that the corners have gone soft as cloth. And then there is the other thing, the bigger thing, the thing that the wall does not have a card for because the wall stops. The wall stops at a date. It is not a round number. It is not a century mark or a decade boundary or anything with the shape of significance to it. It is an ordinary date, in an ordinary month, in a year that is close enough now to be uncomfortable and far enough then to be abstract. And beyond that date the machine will not go. It is not that the missions fail. A failed mission is a known thing, and it has a signature, and there are procedures for it. A failed mission is a child who arrives somewhere slightly wrong and comes home with a headache. Beyond that date, there are no missions. The machine spins up, the field forms, and then, at the moment of lock, the moment when the resonator settles onto a destination and holds it, it does not hold. The instruments show it searching, reaching out along the braid the way it always does, finding the channel, settling, and finding nothing to settle onto, not darkness. The engineers are very insistent about this in their reports, and they get almost angry about it, because everyone who reads the reports assumes darkness, and darkness would be simple, and this is not simple. Darkness would be a destination. Darkness would be a burned world, and a burned world is still a world, and a machine that reads worlds can read a burned one perfectly well. What is beyond that date is not a burned world. What is beyond that date, according to the machine, is not a place. The technical term in the logs is no coherent target state. They try 11 times over 4 years, with 3 separate hardware revisions, and on the 11th attempt they lose the platform's entire primary bus and a technician's hearing, and after that the attempt is not repeated. And Lucas Mercer, who has never refused a mission in his life, refuses that one. He's asked twice. The second time, by a man senior enough that no child in that building had ever said no to him, and Lucas says no anyway, politely, sitting very straight in a chair too big for him with his hands in his lap. He's asked why. And Lucas says the thing that ends up copied into 4 separate files and quoted by people who never met him. The sentence that Ethan will read 50 years later at 2 a.m. in a rented room and put his hand over his mouth. Lucas says, "Because I have already been, and I do not want to go again." Now, Ethan Holloway has been chasing all of this for 11 months when he finds the document that reorganises everything he thinks he knows. It is not a dramatic document. It is a program justification memorandum, 40 pages, addressed to a review board, written in the exhausted bureaucratic prose of a man defending his budget in a bad year. Ethan finds it in the papers of a deceased official, donated to a university library by a family that clearly had not read them, catalogued under the man's committee, Work on Aviation Safety, and in the middle of it, on page 26, under a heading about long-term programmatic value, is a paragraph that is not about aviation. It says, in effect, this: the program's purpose is not historical research. Historical research is a byproduct. The program's purpose is not predictive intelligence, although predictive intelligence has been the most immediately useful output, and is what most of the consumers believe they are receiving. The program's purpose is survey, because if the braid is real, then there are not merely many futures. There are effectively infinite futures, all of them extending forward from this moment, all of them equally real, and the overwhelming majority of them are bad. That is not pessimism. That is arithmetic. There are vastly more ways for a complex system to fail than to persist. Most channels of the delta silt up. Most of them end in something the memo describes only as terminal discontinuity. But not all. Some channels continue. In some channels there are people in the 23rd century, and the 24th, and beyond. And the memo notes that observations at those distances are unreliable, but that a small number of transits have returned survey data consistent with continued organised human activity at extremely long range. And the machine can tell the difference, not by predicting, by looking. So the real objective of Project Pegasus, according to that paragraph on page 26, is to map the delta, to send observers out along channel after channel after channel, and to find out which ones continue and which ones stop, and then slowly, carefully, invisibly, to steer. Not by changing anything. You cannot change anything. That was established in 1969, by moving, by choosing which channel to return into. Every transit shifts you sideways by a tiny amount, and if you understand the mechanism well enough, and if you run enough transits, then that tiny amount becomes a rudder. You do not change the river. You pick which branch of it you are floating down. Ethan reads the paragraph 4 times. The government was not trying to fix history. The government had concluded that history could not be fixed. It had concluded something much stranger and much colder, which is that history could be negotiated, one imperceptible increment at a time, and that the entire apparatus of the programme, the children, the wall, the archivists, the drifting lampshades and the extra letters in grandmothers' names was the cost of steering. Everyone alive was being quietly moved. Nobody was ever going to notice because noticing requires a fixed reference, and the only fixed references in the building were 31 children who had been trained not to forget. And then there are the visitors. They appear in the mission reports beginning in 1972, and they appear only on the forward missions, and only beyond a certain range, and the reports about them are so consistent and so strange that a separate file is opened. The children describe people who do not fit. Not aliens, nothing like that. People. Ordinary people, adult, human, unremarkable to look at, except that their clothing does not correspond to the period around them, and their manner does not correspond to anything. They stand in the wrong places. They stand in the places from which the observation is being conducted, which is to say, they stand where the child is standing, or a few meters from it, and they do not appear to be doing anything at all, and they know. That is the part that no physicist can account for, and no psychologist can dismiss. 11 separate children, across 9 years, in 6 different target decades, independently report that one of these figures looked directly at them and gave some sign of recognition. A nod, a raised hand. In one case, a man who checked his wristwatch looked at the child and shook his head very slightly, the way a person does when someone is late, and once, only once, an exchange of words. Lucas Mercer, age 13, on the last forward mission he ever flies, standing on a footbridge over a river in a city he is instructed not to name, watching a crowd he is instructed only to count. A man comes and stands beside him at the rail. The man is perhaps 60. He is dressed unremarkably. He looks out at the water for a while and then he says, without turning his head, in an ordinary conversational tone, "You are early." And Lucas, who has been trained for 4 years never to respond, never to engage, never to acknowledge, says the only thing he can think of, which is, "Early for what?" And the man says, "For us." Then he walks away, and the transit recovers Lucas 11 minutes later, and Lucas reports the exchange in full, because Lucas always reports everything. The file on the visitors is eventually retitled. It begins as anomalous contact. By 1975, somebody with a better sense of what they are looking at has renamed it, and the new title sits on the folder for the rest of the programme's existence, and it is only 2 words long. Downstream personnel. Somebody, somewhere in that building, had worked out that the visitors were not intruding on the missions. The visitors were meeting them, and if you were going to meet an observer from 1972 at a specific point on a specific footbridge on a specific afternoon, a very long way downstream, then you would need to know that the observer was going to be there, which meant somebody had the schedule. And here is the last piece of it, the piece that Ethan finds in a budget appendix, of all places, because that is where everything true is always found. Pegasus was Phase 1. There was a Phase 2. It is named in 3 documents and described in none of them, and its name is Project Kronos, and the single line of description that survives anywhere in the public record reads, "Permanent forward emplacement of qualified adult personnel into selected survey channels for the purpose of continuity assurance." Read that again, slowly, and let it settle as you drift. Permanent forward emplacement, not a mission, not an observation, a one-way trip. Adults, selected and trained, sent forward into the channels that the children had already surveyed and marked as viable, with no expectation of return, for the purpose of making sure that those channels stay viable. Officially, Kronos was cancelled in 1976. The cancellation memorandum exists. It is signed. It is entirely convincing. The budget for Kronos does not stop in 1976. It is reduced and renamed and moved under a different heading, and it continues at a diminished but perfectly steady level for another 11 years, and then it disappears from the documents Ethan can access altogether, which is not the same as stopping. You do not spend 11 years funding a cancelled program, unless you are funding the people you already sent. Officially, Project Pegasus ends in the early 1970s. There is a final report. There is a decommissioning schedule. There is a memorandum thanking the staff for their service and reminding them of their continuing obligations under the terms of their agreements. And it is a perfectly ordinary memorandum, and it could have been written about any program that ever ran out of money. And the children go home. That is what the file says. The children go home, and their families are informed that the program has concluded, and the families are given a letter to keep. And the letter says that their son or daughter participated in an advanced educational enrichment initiative in the sciences, sponsored by the federal government, and that the family should be very proud. Some of the families frame the letter. The debriefing process at the end is described in the file as psychological reintegration, and it takes 6 weeks, and what it consists of is never spelled out anywhere Ethan can find, but the outcomes are recorded in a table, and the table is unambiguous. Of 31 children in Group 3, 29 retained no coherent recollection of the program within 2 years of separation. They remembered something. They all remembered something. They remembered a summer science camp. They remembered a long bus ride and a building with no windows and being bored and doing puzzles. One of them remembered swimming, which is interesting because there was no water anywhere in that facility. They grew up. That is the part that Ethan finds unbearable, more than any of the rest of it. He tracks down what he can, and they simply grew up. They became a dentist and a school teacher, and a woman who ran a hardware store in Ohio for 31 years, and a man who died in a car accident at 26, and a grandmother of 9. They had ordinary lives, and in most of those lives there is a period in childhood that is slightly hazy, the way everyone's childhood has hazy periods, and none of them ever thought twice about it. The suppression worked. It is an extraordinary thing to have to write down, but it worked, and it worked well, and whatever was done to those 31 children in those 6 weeks was thorough enough that 29 of them carried it to their graves without ever knowing they were carrying anything. 2 did not. One was a girl who began having severe episodes at 19 and spent much of her adult life in and out of care, and whose medical file, when Ethan eventually sees a fragment of it, contains the phrase persistent delusional content regarding governmental experimentation, which is a sentence that means one thing if it is not true, and something else entirely if it is. And one was Lucas Mercer. Because you cannot suppress a memory in a boy who does not experience contradiction as distress. Suppression works by making the real memory uncomfortable and the false one comfortable, and then letting the mind do what minds do, which is to prefer comfort. Lucas held both. He held all of them. He held the summer science camp and the swimming pool and the puzzles and the underground corridor and the rings and the footbridge over the river and the man who said you are early, and he held them all with equal calm in the same drawer, forever. Lucas Mercer went home to the Midwest in 1974 at the age of 13, and he remembered every single thing. And now we come back to Ethan in the present day, holding a cardboard box in a garage, because the last piece of it is his father. Raymond Holloway did not work on Pegasus in the 1970s and then move on. That is the assumption Ethan started with. That is the reasonable assumption. A young engineer works on something extraordinary and classified, and the program ends, and he goes on to spend 3 decades doing something else, and he never speaks of it, and he dies with it. The badges say otherwise. 3 badges, 3 contractors, 3 faces at 3 ages, and when Ethan finally lines up the dates against the contracts, and the contracts against the facilities, and the facilities against a map, he finds that his father's employer changed name and ownership 4 times over 35 years, and that his father's job title changed 6 times, and that his father's actual physical place of work, the building he drove to, never changed at all. Raymond Holloway spent 35 years maintaining the same equipment. The machine was never dismantled. Machines like that are not dismantled. That is the sentence Ethan writes in his notebook and underlines, and it is the thing that anyone who has ever worked around large hardware understands immediately, and everyone else finds hard to believe. You do not scrap a resonator ring assembly that took 4 years and an appalling amount of money to fabricate. You do not throw away the only 2 of something that exist in the world. You crate it, and you move it, and you build a shed over it, and you keep 3 people on payroll to run a dehumidifier and check the bearings twice a year, and you wait. Inside the VHS case, tucked behind the cassette where it had sat for however many decades, folded into eighths, is a sheet of drafting film. It is a plan view. It is beautiful. It is his father's line work, unmistakably, but done at a level of care that suggests it was drawn slowly, over many evenings, by a man who was not being paid to draw it. It shows a facility, not the one in the Polaroids, a different one, deeper, larger, laid out in a series of concentric levels around a central chamber, with the chamber annotated in his father's tiny, precise handwriting. Primary assembly, both rings installed. There is a location. It is not written as an address. It is written as a set of coordinates in the margin, in a different pen, in handwriting that is shakier, which means his father wrote them late. And there is one more note at the bottom of the sheet, in that same shaky late hand. It says, "Power draw increased 2011, still increasing, not us." Ethan drives out there in October. I am not going to tell you exactly where, because the story does not tell us either, and because the not knowing is part of what makes it work. It is desert. It is a very long way from a paved road. It is the kind of place where the horizon is a full circle, and the silence has a pressure to it, and Ethan parks his car in the last of the light and sleeps in it badly and goes in at dawn. What is on the surface is nothing. A fenced compound the size of a supermarket parking lot, a collapsed prefabricated building, 2 concrete pads with the bolt patterns of long-removed equipment, signage so faded that the warnings have gone the colour of the sky. But the fence has been maintained. That is the first wrong thing, and Ethan notices it within a minute of arriving, because he has been an analyst for 11 years and he cannot help himself. The fence is old, but 3 of its posts are not. 3 posts have been replaced, and the concrete around their bases is a different colour, and it is not 30 years old, and out here in this air nothing ages slowly enough to fool you. The second wrong thing is the road. It is unpaved, and it is nearly invisible, and it is absolutely, unmistakably in use. The third wrong thing is the sound. He hears it when he is standing in the middle of the compound at about 7 in the morning with the sun just clearing the ridge, and at first he takes it for wind, and then for his own blood, and then he crouches and puts his palm flat on the concrete pad. The pad is humming, very faintly, a low, patient rhythmic pulse coming up through the concrete into the bones of his hand, the pulse of something very large running somewhere a long way below. It takes him most of the day to find the way in, and I will not describe it, because that part of the story is the part that Ethan himself was always careful about. It is enough to say that the entrance is where his father's drawing said it would be, and that it is not locked, which frightens him more than a lock would have. The stairs go down for a long time, and at the bottom of them, behind a door standing open, is the control room, and in the control room the lights are on. Not emergency lights, working lights, fluorescent tubes and ceiling fixtures, humming at a pitch just high enough to feel in the teeth, and Ethan stands in the doorway of a room that has been abandoned for 50 years and is fully powered, and he can smell, very faintly, the sharp, clean metallic smell of ozone. Beyond the control room, through leaded glass, is the chamber. 2 rings, one inside the other, Enormous, dull, motionless, mounted on opposed axes, with a circular platform of polished alloy at the centre of them, and a shallow lip around its edge, and a fine layer of dust on everything except the platform, which is clean. There is a coffee cup on the console. It is not old. And on the desk beside it, sitting square in the middle of the blotter as though it had been put there for him, is a videotape. Ethan looks at it for a very long time before he touches it. He's aware, in a distant sort of way, of how badly his hands are shaking. The label is typed, not word processed. Typed on a typewriter, with the same slightly uneven ribbon as the tape in his father's box, which is not possible, because the label reads, recording date, August 17th, 2039, 13 years from the morning on which he is standing there reading it. There is a player in the room. Of course there is a player in the room. The tape is 11 minutes long. It shows a room. This exact control room, in better condition, better lit, with equipment on the consoles that Ethan has never seen. 4 people. 3 of them are working. One is sitting at the desk, half turned toward the camera, an older woman with her sleeves rolled up, and she's talking to the others, and the audio is perfectly clear. They are discussing a problem with the third-bearing race. They are discussing the schedule. And then one of them, a younger man, asks a question about a name, and the woman at the desk answers, and the name she says is Holloway. They are talking about Ethan, not his father. Ethan. They use his first name. They discuss what he has published and how far he has got, and one of them asks a question about timing, and the woman says a date, and it is a date 11 weeks from the morning Ethan is standing there, and everyone in the room nods as if this is entirely settled and slightly overdue. And then, at the end, the woman at the desk pushes her chair back and turns and looks directly into the lens. She looks tired and kind and utterly unsurprised. She says, "If you are watching this, then you have already found us." And then she says, "It is all right. It has always gone this way." The tape ends. Now sit with this for a moment, because it is the turn, and if you are still awake for anything tonight, let it be this. Ethan's first thought is that the tape was recorded in 2039 and left here, in this room, and that it has been sitting on this desk waiting for him, which would mean it was recorded and then somehow stored for negative 13 years, which is meaningless. His second thought is the correct one. The tape was not stored. The tape was sent, not forward, backward. That is what the machine has always done best, and the thing nobody outside the program ever grasped, because everybody was so busy imagining people travelling that they never stopped to think about the far simpler and far more useful thing, which is that if you can move a steel sphere, you can move a document. Information does not need to survive the trip intact. That was the great limitation, the fogged film, the blank tape, the reason children had to be used at all. But that limitation applied to recordings made downstream and carried home. It does not apply to a package sent deliberately, prepared by people who spent decades learning exactly how to prepare it. And once Ethan sees that, he sees all of it, and it arrives the way the answer to a puzzle arrives, all at once, with a click. Where did the wartime research come from? The strange folders that made no sense, the few pages that had been reclassified upward twice, and read by almost no one. Where did the field geometry come from? The specific and non-obvious configuration that 11 of the best physicists of their generation could not derive from first principles and simply, at some point, had. Why did the funding never fail? Not once. Through 4 administrations, 2 recessions, a change in the entire structure of the intelligence community, and 1 investigation that came within a corridor's length of finding it. Why did the right man happen to sit on the right committee, every single time, for 35 years? Why was a structural engineer from a small town in Ohio with an unremarkable degree and no particular distinction recruited in 1968 for the most sensitive program in the country? And why did that engineer's son grow up to become an intelligence analyst, and then leave to become a writer, which is to say, become precisely the one thing in the world capable of finding all of this and putting it in front of people? Project Pegasus did not build itself out of the 1960s. Project Pegasus was assembled backward, out of its own future. Every breakthrough delivered at the moment it was needed. Every funding decision nudged. Every engineer selected. Every child chosen. All of it arriving from downstream, from the people who already existed because the program had already succeeded, sending back exactly what was required to make sure that it did. The government spent decades believing that it had built a machine and was operating it. In truth, the machine had been operating the government, not maliciously. That is the strangest part and the part that stays with you. There is no villain anywhere in this. There is only a loop, closed and seamless, and entirely without a beginning, in which a future that wanted to exist reached back and quietly arranged the conditions for its own existence. Over and over, patiently, for 100 years, using ordinary people who thought they were making their own decisions. Ethan publishes. It goes about as well as you would expect. Some of it is verifiable, and the verifiable parts are the boring ones, and the boring parts do not travel. Some of it is dismissed instantly and correctly, because a man with a box of photographs and a videotape has, in the end, a box of photographs and a videotape. He's written about for a while, mostly unkindly. He gives 4 interviews. There is a period of about 3 weeks when a lot of people know his name, and then there is a much longer period when nobody does. He does not seem to mind. That is what everyone who met him in that period says afterward. He seemed like a man who had already read the ending. And then, in the spring, an envelope arrives at his house. No stamp, no postmark, no return address. Hand-delivered at some point during a night when he was at home and heard nothing. Inside there is one photograph. It is a colour photograph, faded to that particular orange of the early 1970s, and it shows a group of children standing in front of the rings in the chamber, arranged in 3 rows the way a class is arranged for a school portrait. They are wearing grey coveralls. Some of them are smiling. The rings loom behind them, out of focus. He counts them. There are 32. The file said 31. Every face is clear. Every face is in focus. Every child looking at the camera. 31 children in a room in 1971. Except one. In the back row, at the left, slightly apart from the others, stands a boy who is not quite in focus. Not blurred by motion, not out of the depth of field, because the boy beside him is perfectly sharp. Just soft. Just slightly. Wrongly indistinct, in the way that a face is indistinct when your eye slides off it. Ethan turns the photograph over. On the back, in handwriting he does not recognise, in pencil, someone has written 3 words. You were there. And underneath, in the same hand, the date the photograph was taken. 1971. Ethan Holloway was born in 1984. Here is the final turn, and then I will let you sleep. The programme's own documents state, over and over, in 100 places, that children were used because children survived the process. The physiology was the reason. The developing brain was the reason. The smooth, beautiful curve on the table was the reason, and it was true, and every word of it was true, and it was not the reason. Because if you were assembling a program backward out of its own future, you would not select children by testing them. You would already know which ones to select. You would know because you already had the mission logs. You would know because those children had already gone downstream in the completed loop, and their names were already written in files that had not been typed yet, and every one of those 31 children was chosen not for what they might be able to do, but because the record showed that they had already done it. The recruitment criteria were never psychological. They were archival. The program did not choose them because they were suitable. It chose them because they were listed. They were selected on the basis of memories they had not yet lived. And that is the whole of it. That is Project Pegasus. And before the night takes us under, if you're listening on Spotify, please take 10 seconds and leave a review. It helps this channel more than you could possibly know, and it means the world to every single member of this community. Now, settle in, get comfortable, because tonight we are going underground. November 1992. It begins not with a discovery. It begins with interference. Somewhere in the vast and frozen interior of Alaska, at a remote seismic monitoring station surrounded by nothing but pine, permafrost and silence, a technician sits alone at a bank of instruments. The equipment around her is designed for one purpose only: to listen, to wait, to detect the deep geological exhale of the earth itself, the trembling of tectonic plates, the low groan of shifting crust, the fingerprint of a distant earthquake rolling across thousands of miles of bedrock before arriving here, in this cold room, on these humming screens. She has done this job for 3 years. She knows what the instruments are supposed to say. She knows the rhythms and the noise and the silence between them. And so when the readout changes, when a signal begins to emerge from the baseline that does not belong, she notices immediately. It is not seismic. Not exactly. The frequency is wrong. The interval is wrong. Earthquakes are chaotic, jagged, unpredictable. They spike and fade. They scatter. This signal does none of those things. This signal pulses, low, steady, at intervals so precise they would later be measured to fractions of a millisecond. Not a tremor, not noise, not instrument error. A rhythm, repeating, patient. As though something deep beneath the ground had been waiting for this exact moment to be heard. She reports it up the chain. The response is quick and routine: equipment calibration issue, likely interference from a nearby installation, nothing to investigate. Log it and move on. She logs it, but the signal does not move on. 3 days later, a station 200 miles to the southeast picks up the same frequency. Then a third station, then a fourth. Each reading consistent, each pulsing in perfect synchronization. The signal is not coming from the equipment, the signal is coming from the ground, and when triangulation software maps the origin point, the coordinates land somewhere in the Alaskan interior, deep in the wilderness, far from any city, far from any known installation, not far from Denali, the highest peak in North America, a mountain so vast, so ancient, so utterly indifferent to human presence that it generates its own weather systems and its own mythology. A place the Athabascan people called Denali, long before European cartographers arrived to rename it, to measure it, to claim it. The mountain has always kept its secrets, but now something beneath it is trying to speak. Act 1. The Survey. The geological survey team that was assembled in the weeks following the initial anomaly reports was small, deliberately so. 4 members, a geophysicist, 2 technicians, a logistics coordinator. Their brief was minimal: travel to the approximate source coordinates, deploy ground-penetrating radar equipment, rule out any natural explanations for the signal readings, and return. Standard protocol. A routine sweep of a remote area. Nothing remarkable was expected. The journey alone took the better part of a week. There are no roads where the coordinates pointed. There is no infrastructure. There is wilderness in the truest sense of that word. Terrain that has not meaningfully changed since the last ice age. Forests dense enough to swallow sound whole. Rivers that shift their banks seasonally, and a cold so absolute in November that the air itself seems to resist your presence. The team travelled by bush plane, then by snowcat, then on foot. They brought with them the kind of equipment that sees through solid rock. Ground-penetrating radar, GPR, works by transmitting radio wave pulses into the earth and measuring how they bounce back. Different materials reflect differently. Soil and bedrock produce one kind of return. Voids produce another. Structures, hollow spaces, chambers, organised forms, produce something else entirely. A trained eye can read those returns the way a doctor reads a scan. You learn to see what the surface refuses to show you. The first day of scanning produced nothing unusual. The second day, the readings began to shift. The returns from The deepest pulses, those reaching several hundred feet below the surface, were coming back wrong. Not malformed, not corrupt. Wrong in a specific, structured, impossible-to-ignore way. The team recalibrated. They checked the equipment from multiple angles. They ran comparison baselines. Every check confirmed what the initial readings had shown. Beneath the permafrost, beneath several hundred feet of ancient, undisturbed rock, there was a shape that had no business being there. The geophysicist on the team, a man named Roland Marsh, according to documents that would surface years later, reportedly sat in silence for a very long time after reviewing the composite scan. He had spent 20 years reading geological data. He had surveyed mountain ranges and ocean floors. He had studied formations that challenged every assumption about natural geology. He had never seen anything like this. The shape was symmetrical, four-sided, each face inclined at a consistent angle toward a single, converging point at the top. The geometry was not approximate, it was not close, it was exact in a way that natural stone formations simply are not. Nature produces beauty, yes. Nature produces breathtaking complexity. But nature does not produce perfect angles, at perfect ratios, at perfect scale, buried perfectly beneath hundreds of feet of undisturbed earth. The shape was a pyramid, and according to the initial field measurements, it was significantly larger than the Great Pyramid of Giza. AC2, the shape, beneath the world. Let's be very precise about what the measurements suggested, because precision matters here. The Great Pyramid of Giza stands approximately 480 feet tall at its original height. Its base spans approximately 756 feet on each side. It is, by every reasonable measure, one of the largest structures ever constructed by human hands. A monument so vast it generates its own atmospheric microclimate. A structure so precisely aligned that its corners point within a fraction of a degree to true north. The formation detected beneath the Alaskan interior, according to the field readings compiled by Roland Marsh's team, exceeded those dimensions considerably. The base measurements were difficult to determine precisely given the depth and the equipment available, but conservative estimates placed the span at well over 1,000 feet. The apex, the highest point of the structure as detected by the radar returns, sat hundreds of feet below the surface, meaning the structure itself extended even deeper. Its full vertical dimension could not be measured with the equipment on hand. To put that in terms that make it easier to feel rather than just understand. Imagine burying the Empire State Building entirely underground, then building something significantly larger directly beside it, and then burying that too. That is the approximate scale of what the radar suggested was sitting beneath the Alaskan wilderness, completely hidden, completely silent except for that low, rhythmic pulse that had started all of this. The team spent 3 additional days scanning. Every pass confirmed the same readings. Every angle reinforced the same geometry. The signal, the original signal that had triggered the entire investigation, appeared to emanate from within the structure itself, from somewhere near its centre, from somewhere deep inside whatever this thing was. On the 4th day, Marsh filed his preliminary report via encrypted satellite communication. Within 48 hours, the team was contacted and told to stand down. They were instructed to secure all data, all equipment, all physical notes, and prepare for extraction. A second team would take over the site. No further information was provided. No explanation was given. The team was airlifted out. Their equipment was confiscated at the staging point. Their personal notes were collected. They were separately debriefed, signed non-disclosure documentation, and dispersed. Roland Marsh would not speak publicly about what he saw for more than a decade. When he eventually did speak, in fragments, to a single researcher who spent years earning his trust, he said only this: "The geometry was real. I have never been able to explain it, and I have spent a very long time trying." Act 3. Classification. The apparatus of government secrecy is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It does not arrive, with black helicopters and men in dark suits delivering ultimatums, though that image has become so embedded in the popular imagination that we sometimes forget how bureaucratic and mundane the real machinery of classification actually is. Most secrets are kept not through intimidation but through paperwork, through the quiet reassignment of jurisdiction, through the reclassification of file categories, through the slow, methodical layering of one administrative wall upon another until the original thing, the original event, the original finding, becomes inaccessible, not because it was destroyed, but because it was buried beneath 1,000 layers of bureaucratic fog. Control of the Denali site was reassigned within days of the original team's extraction. The jurisdiction passed through at least 3 separate governmental entities before landing with a joint operational body that had connections to both defence research and what was officially described as geological hazard assessment. The site itself was designated a restricted geological anomaly zone, a classification that exists in Federal Land Management Code, and that is, in practice, almost never invoked. It is a designation with no fixed duration. It requires no public notice. It can be maintained indefinitely without congressional review. The area around the coordinates was quietly added to restricted airspace maps. Ground access was designated off-limits under environmental protection statutes that, while technically accurate, were not the real reason for the restriction. Scientists and researchers who subsequently tried to obtain permits to conduct independent surveys of the region found their applications delayed, then denied, then rerouted through bureaucratic channels that led nowhere. One internal document, a single page, partially redacted, that would surface decades later through a Freedom of Information filing that itself took 9 years to process, described the formation in terms that have never been officially acknowledged or retracted. The document referred to the structure as non-natural, non-random, non-replicable. 3 words, that is all. But those 3 words, in the cold language of government scientific assessment, carry an extraordinary weight. Non-natural means it did not form through geological processes. Non-random means its geometry is deliberate. Non-replicable means that no known human construction methodology, not ancient, not modern, not theoretical, could account for what the scans showed. The document was stamped, filed, and buried, and the mountain kept its silence. For a while. Acid 4, Dr. Aaron Vance. There is a particular kind of scientist who is drawn not to the questions that have answers, but to the questions that have been abandoned. The ones that sit in archive folders and filing cabinets and digitized database records, untouched not because they were resolved, but because the people who might have resolved them were told in one way or another to look somewhere else. These scientists are not conspiracy theorists. They are in many respects the opposite. Meticulous, sceptical, methodologically conservative people who have simply noticed that certain data sets do not add up, and who find that fact more interesting than the approved explanation. Dr. Aaron Vance was one of these people. He had spent the majority of his career in geophysics, specifically in the study of low-frequency seismic signals and their relationship to geological stress patterns. His work was unglamorous and largely invisible to the public. He published in specialist journals. He presented at conferences attended by other specialists. He was, by all professional accounts, good at what he did and entirely uninterested in anything beyond the data. The data, however, eventually led him somewhere unexpected. It began during an archival project in the mid-2000s, when Vance was reviewing seismic records from the early 1990s as part of a broader study into baseline signal drift across North American monitoring stations. He was looking for a completely different thing, a specific pattern related to glacial isostatic adjustment, the slow geological rebound of land masses as ancient ice sheets continue to retreat thousands of years after the last ice age. What he found instead, buried in the archived data from multiple Alaskan stations, was a set of readings he could not explain. A low-frequency signal, rhythmic, originating from a fixed geographic point, present across multiple independent stations simultaneously. The signal had been logged, briefly noted as anomalous, and then apparently dismissed without further investigation. Vance ran the coordinates. They pointed to the Alaskan interior, not far from Denali. He cross-referenced with every known catalogue of seismic events from that period. Nothing matched. He checked for industrial activity, military testing, known underground infrastructure. Nothing in the area. He reviewed the signal characteristics against his own extensive experience with naturally occurring geological phenomena. Nothing in the natural world produced signals with that frequency profile and that degree of rhythmic precision. And then he ran the archived data against the current monitoring feeds. The signal was still there, not continuous, not always detectable at the same intensity, but present, recurring, originating from the same fixed coordinates it had occupied in 1992. 12 years later, the ground beneath the Alaskan interior was still pulsing. Whatever was down there had not stopped. Act 5, the mathematical pattern. The thing that distinguishes a scientist from a speculator is what they do when they encounter something they cannot explain. A speculator reaches for the most dramatic interpretation. A scientist reaches for more data. Vance spent the better part of 2 years doing nothing but gathering more data. He built a comprehensive time series record of every detectable instance of the signal, across every accessible monitoring station in the region, going back to the earliest available records. He normalized for equipment variation, seasonal temperature effects, atmospheric interference, and baseline drift. He applied every standard correction factor. And when the corrected data was laid out, what he found beneath all the noise was something that made him sit very still for a very long time. The signal followed a mathematical sequence, not approximately, not loosely, precisely. The intervals between pulse clusters corresponded to a recursive numerical pattern, a sequence in which each value is a function of the preceding values in a fixed and repeating relationship. The kind of pattern that, in nature, appears in the branching of plants and the spiral geometry of shells and the proportional relationships of living structures. The kind of pattern that mathematicians have studied for centuries because it appears again and again at the intersections of natural growth and fundamental physics. It was not random noise that happened to look like a pattern. It was a pattern, one that would require either an extraordinary coincidence of natural forces or something far more unsettling: design. Vance wrote up his findings internally. He shared them with 2 colleagues whose judgment he trusted completely. Scientists with no prior knowledge of or interest in the Denali region, people who had no reason to confirm what he was seeing if it wasn't genuinely there. Both confirmed it. The pattern was real, the sequence was mathematically coherent, and the signal producing it was coming from somewhere beneath the Alaskan wilderness, from a fixed point in the Earth, and it had been doing so for at least as long as the monitoring record existed. Vance began, cautiously, to develop a hypothesis. What if the signal was not a byproduct? What if it was not geological noise or residual vibration from some ancient inert structure? What if the signal was the point? What if whatever was buried beneath Denali was not simply sitting there, but operating? Akite 6. The energy anomaly. A structure can be inert. The pyramids of Giza are inert. They sit. They endure. They do nothing except exist. And that existence is remarkable enough that millions of people travel thousands of miles every year simply to stand near them. But they are passive, stone arranged by human hands, massive and magnificent, but ultimately just matter in a particular configuration. What Vance was looking at was not inert. His analysis of the signal's characteristics, its frequency profile, its interaction with the surrounding geological matrix, the way it propagated through different rock types at different depths, led him to a conclusion that he described in his private notes as the most uncomfortable finding of my professional life. The signal was not merely passing through the rock. It was interacting with it in ways that suggested an active electromagnetic relationship between the source and the surrounding material. In the immediate vicinity of the source coordinates, the zone directly above and around whatever was generating the pulse, the geological data showed something extraordinary. Seismic noise was lower than it should be, significantly lower. The background vibration that exists everywhere on Earth, the constant low-level trembling produced by ocean waves and atmospheric pressure, and distant human activity and 1,000 other sources was measurably suppressed in that region, as though something was absorbing it, or cancelling it. The electromagnetic readings from the area were also anomalous. Instruments designed to measure the Earth's natural magnetic field showed localised distortions that did not correspond to any known geological feature. The distortions were not random. They were organised, arranged in a pattern that, when mapped, corresponded precisely to the outline of the buried structure as suggested by the original ground-penetrating radar data. Vance proposed, carefully and with extensive qualification, that the structure might not simply be transmitting a signal. It might be generating energy, producing something, electromagnetic output, acoustic resonance, some combination of physical effects, without any apparent external fuel source, continuously, for decades at minimum, possibly for far, far longer. He knew how this sounded. He said so explicitly in his notes. I am aware that this conclusion, stated plainly, sounds like science fiction. I have spent considerable effort trying to arrive at any other conclusion. I cannot. The data is what it is. The data was what it was, and the structure, whatever it was, had not stopped running. ACT-7, inside the mountain. Through a chain of connections that Vance would later describe only as a sequence of fortunate introductions, he gained access to something he had no official right to see, a set of deeper scan composites that had been produced during the classified phase of the investigation in the years following the original survey. The data had been compiled using more sophisticated equipment than the field team had carried, technology deployed by the successor operation that had taken over the site after the original team was extracted. The images were extraordinary. The outer geometry that the original team had detected, the pyramidal shape, the four faces, the converging apex, was confirmed and refined. But the deeper scans revealed something the original equipment had not been capable of showing. What was inside? There were chambers, multiple chambers, arranged at consistent intervals along the structure's vertical axis. Each chamber was roughly symmetrical in its own right. Between the chambers, the scans showed corridors, not passages in the rough organic sense that natural cave systems produce, but linear, precise, dimensionally consistent passages that connected the interior spaces in an organised way. And running through the centre of the entire structure, from somewhere near the base all the way to the apex, was a vertical shaft, a central column of space, perfectly aligned with the structure's axis, rising through everything. The outer shell of the structure, the material that the radar pulses were bouncing off of to produce these images, was something Vance could not identify. It was not stone in the conventional sense. The reflectivity profile was wrong. Stone of various types produces characteristic radar returns that experienced geophysicists learn to read the way musicians read sheet music. This material returned something different, denser, more uniform, with a reflectivity profile that suggested either an extremely unusual natural mineral composition or something that was not natural rock at all. Attempts had apparently been made during the classified phase to obtain physical samples. Drilling had been attempted at the surface above the structure's edge. The drill equipment had failed. Not in the sense that it encountered rock too hard to penetrate. Rock can always be penetrated given enough time and the right equipment. It failed in the sense that the equipment itself broke down in ways that the engineering team described as inexplicable. Components that should have lasted for weeks of continuous operation failed within hours. Multiple attempts produced the same results. Whatever the outer shell of the structure was made of, it did not want to be sampled. Act 8. The cover and the truth beneath it. The official position has never changed. According to every public record, every government statement, every response to every Freedom of Information request that has successfully made it through the processing system, there is nothing beneath the Alaskan interior near Denali that requires any particular explanation. The restricted airspace is environmental. The land access restrictions are precautionary. The monitoring activity in the region is routine. There is no pyramid. There is no signal. There is no structure. This is the narrative that has been maintained with remarkable consistency across multiple administrations, multiple agency reshuffles, multiple generational turnovers of personnel. The people who managed the secret in the 1990s are mostly retired or dead. The people managing it now, if it is still being actively managed, may not even know the full history of what they are guarding. Classification can become self-perpetuating. A restriction put in place for reasons that were urgent in one decade can persist into the next through sheer institutional inertia, maintained by people who follow the protocols without ever being told why the protocols exist. But there are threads, small ones, inconsistencies in the public record that only become visible when you look at enough of the surrounding context simultaneously. There is the matter of the airspace designation, which uses a regulatory category that is technically reserved for areas of active geological instability, an area that all publicly available geological surveys describe as among the most stable in the entire state. There is the matter of the monitoring budget allocation for the region, which is significantly higher than comparable regions with no known points of interest. There is the matter of a research permit denial from the early 2000s, in which the denial letter references ongoing scientific operations at the site, operations that have never been named, described, or publicly acknowledged. And there is the matter of the signal, which anyone with access to the right monitoring equipment and the right archived data can find if they know where to look. It has not been hidden. It has simply been left unexplained, which is almost the same thing, because most people do not look at raw seismic data, and the people who do are generally not looking for something that should not be there. Vance looked, and the signal looked back. Act 9, the direction of the signal. The final phase of Vance's investigation was the one that changed everything. He had spent years establishing that the signal existed, that it was structured, that it corresponded to a physical formation in the earth, and that the formation appeared to be actively generating something. All of that was extraordinary. But a buried structure generating a signal, however inexplicable, is still a local phenomenon. It is strange, but it is contained. It is a mystery with a boundary. What Vance found next had no boundary. He had been assuming, as anyone would, that the signal propagated outward in all directions from its source, the way a stone dropped in still water sends ripples in every direction equally. This is how most geological signals behave. This is how acoustic resonance works in stone. This is the expected physics of the situation. But when he mapped the actual propagation of the signal across the monitoring network, plotting the relative strength and timing of the signal at every station that had detected it, and working backward to reconstruct the directionality of its spread, the picture that emerged was not a circle, not a sphere, not an outward radial propagation. The signal was directional. It was not broadcasting equally in all directions. It was focused, aimed, like a beam rather than a broadcast. And when Vance traced those directional lines across the Earth's surface, extending them beyond the monitoring network, following their geometry across geography, he found that several of them terminated at points of extraordinary significance. The lines pointed to locations with ancient structures, monuments, sites of archaeological significance that span multiple cultures, multiple continents, multiple millennia. Places that humanity has found remarkable for thousands of years without fully understanding why. Places built, according to the conventional historical record, by separate civilizations with no known contact with one another, and yet places that share, again and again, certain striking geometrical and astronomical properties. The signal from beneath Denali appeared to be reaching toward them. Vance was careful, in the way that scientists are careful when they know they are standing at the edge of something that cannot be unseen. He did not immediately conclude that the directionality was intentional. He spent months testing alternative hypotheses. Perhaps the apparent directionality was an artifact of the monitoring network's geometry, a statistical illusion produced by where the stations were placed rather than where the signal was actually going. He tested this by using subsets of stations in different configurations and running the propagation model again. The result was consistent every time. The directionality was real. Perhaps the signal was being refracted by geological features. shaped by the particular density and composition of the rock it was passing through, in the same way that light bends when it passes through water at an angle. He tested this by modelling the geological profile of the region and calculating what refraction effects would look like in the data. The modelled refraction did not match the observed directionality. The signal was going where it appeared to be going, not where the rock was sending it. And perhaps the coincidence of the terminal points was exactly that. Coincidence. Perhaps the lines drawn from the Denali signal simply happened to pass near sites of archaeological significance. The way lines drawn from any point on a globe will inevitably pass near something interesting if you extend them far enough across a planet as densely layered with human history as this one. Vance tested this too, running a statistical analysis that asked how likely it was, given a random set of directional lines from a random point, to intersect with sites of known significance at the rate he was observing. The probability was not zero, but it was very, very low. Low enough that the coincidence explanation required more faith than the alternative. ACE-10, the network. The theory that Vance developed at this stage of his research was the most ambitious and the most difficult to prove. It was also, he believed, the most important. He proposed that the Denali structure was not unique, that it was not an isolated anomaly, that buried beneath various points on the Earth's surface, points that might correspond to ancient sites, or to regions of unusual geological behaviour, or to areas that have attracted human reverence across centuries without any obvious explanation. There might be other structures, other nodes, other sources of that same low-frequency signal, each aimed, each directional, each connected to the others through a network whose architecture spanned the entire planet. The implications of this theory are difficult to process even in the abstract, because if it is correct, if the Denali structure is one node in a global network of buried structures, all of them communicating, all of them generating signals pointed at one another, then the question is not simply what they are. The question is what they are doing, what the network is for, what it is maintaining, or measuring, or transmitting. And perhaps most unsettling of all, who built it? Because whatever the timeline is, it does not fit neatly into any known chapter of human history. The structure beneath Denali sits beneath undisturbed permafrost that geological dating suggests has not been disturbed since the last ice age, the ice age that ended approximately 12,000 years ago. That is 6,000 years before the earliest known complex human civilization, 8,000 years before the first pyramid was constructed in Egypt, more than 10,000 years before any written historical record begins. If the structure was built, it was built by something or someone that we have no record of, no mythology adequate to contain, no framework to understand, and yet there it sits, patient, active, still running after all this time. Act 11, the 2012 activation. Vance's time series analysis of the signal's historical intensity revealed something else. It was not constant. The signal was strongest, most detectable, most clearly structured in its mathematical patterning during specific windows of time. Between those windows it did not disappear entirely. It merely quieted, retreated to a lower intensity that required sensitive equipment and careful filtering to detect at all. Then, at certain intervals, it surged again, not randomly, at intervals that, like the signal's own internal pattern, followed a structure rather than a chaos. The most recent major surge on record occurred in 2012. The significance of that year is not lost on anyone who remembers the cultural moment around it. 2012 was the year the ancient Mayan long-count calendar completed a major cycle, an event that the popular imagination had attached an enormous amount of apocalyptic and mystical significance to. Predictions about the end of the world, or the dawn of a new age, or some fundamental shift in cosmic or human affairs, filled books and films and news cycles. Most of it was sensationalism built on misunderstanding. The Mayan calendar cycle ended and the next one began and nothing dramatic happened. And yet, 2012 was also a year of elevated electromagnetic activity globally. Solar activity during that period was high, producing geomagnetic events that affected satellite systems and power grids in various regions. Atmospheric phenomena were recorded at unusual frequencies in certain latitudes, and across the network of geophysical monitoring stations that Vance had been using to track the Denali signal, multiple anomalous readings were logged within a 6-week window, centred on the December solstice of that year. The Denali signal during this period was the strongest it had been in the entire available record, more precisely structured, more clearly directional, more coherent in its mathematical patterning than at any other point Vance could identify. It was as though something had woken up, or more accurately, as though something that was always awake had for a period raised its voice, and then quieted again, back to the baseline, back to the patient, low, rhythmic pulse that had been there all along, waiting for whatever comes next. Act 12. What the Mountain Knows. There is something almost meditative about sitting with a mystery this large and this old and this thoroughly unresolved. Most mysteries, given enough time and enough investigation, yield. They have edges. They have answers somewhere in them, even if those answers are difficult to reach. They are puzzles, and puzzles have solutions. This does not feel like a puzzle. This feels like something older than puzzles. Something that existed before the categories we use to understand the world were invented. Before science and religion and history and mythology, all the different languages humanity has developed for describing what it cannot immediately explain, were available to reach for. Whatever sits beneath the Alaskan interior does not care about our categories. It is not waiting for us to classify it correctly. It is not holding its secrets as a challenge for us to overcome. It exists on its own timeline, operating according to its own logic, doing whatever it has been doing since long before the first human being looked up at the stars and wondered what they were. The mountain above it, Denali, the Great One, the High One, has been standing for millions of years. Long before any human eye saw it. Long before any culture gave it a name. The rock and ice of it have weathered everything. Ice ages and warm periods and tectonic shifts and the slow, geological revolution of a planet in constant motion. It will still be there long after every city humanity has ever built has been erased by the same geological processes that shaped it. And beneath it, something pulses, something measures, something waits. The question that keeps returning, the one that Vance returned to again and again in his notes, the one that sits at the bottom of this entire story like a stone you cannot quite lift, is not what the structure is. It is not when it was built or what it is made of or how it generates its signal without any fuel source we can identify. The question is simpler than all of that, and harder. What is it for? Act 13. The people who know not everyone involved in the story of the Denali structure is a scientist or a bureaucrat or a theorist sitting at a desk with access to archived data. Some of the most interesting pieces of this puzzle come from an entirely different direction. From the people who have lived near the mountain for longer than any government agency, any monitoring station, any geophysical research project has existed. The Athabascan peoples of interior Alaska have inhabited the region surrounding Denali for thousands of years. Their relationship with the mountain is not the relationship of the tourist, or the climber, or the scientist. It is ancestral, embedded, passed down through generations in the form of story and song and ceremony, and a kind of intimate geographical knowledge that develops when people live in relationship with a landscape over centuries, rather than simply passing through it. In the oral traditions of various Athabascan groups, there are stories about the mountain that do not fit neatly into the categories of legend or folklore, as the Western tradition uses those words. Stories about a presence beneath the mountain, about a sound that certain places emit in certain conditions, a low, almost felt rather than heard vibration that elders have described in ways that, when translated, sound remarkably like what the seismic monitoring stations recorded. About the mountain as something more than geological, something with purpose, something that existed before the people arrived and that will continue after they are gone. These traditions were not developed in response to the 1992 monitoring anomaly. They predate it by generations. They predate any contact with Western scientific culture. They are older than the monitoring equipment, older than the research stations, older than the state of Alaska itself. and they describe something beneath the mountain that has always been there. Something that pulses, something that connects, something that, in the words of one elder's account as recorded by an anthropologist in the 1970s, breathes on a schedule that is not ours. The scientists arrived in 1992 and found a signal. The Athabascan people had been living alongside that signal for millennia. They did not need instruments to detect it. They had simply learned to understand it as part of the world, a feature of the landscape as natural, in its own way, as the river's current and the seasonal migration of animals and the long, tilting dance of the sun across the Alaskan sky. Whether that makes the structure more explicable or less is a question worth sitting with. Act 14. The Architecture of Concealment. Every large secret requires maintenance. It does not maintain itself. Someone has to renew the access restrictions each year. Someone has to process the freedom of information denials. Someone has to ensure that the monitoring budget continues to flow without attracting scrutiny. Someone has to keep the airspace designation current. Someone has to know enough to keep knowing what they need to know, while ensuring that no one else knows more than they need to. The architecture of concealment around the Denali site, if the theories are correct, has now been in place for over 3 decades. 3 decades during which the technology for independent geological investigation has advanced dramatically. 3 decades during which satellite imaging has become sophisticated enough to detect surface anomalies in remote terrain that would have been completely invisible to earlier generations. 3 decades during which ground-penetrating radar technology has advanced to the point where commercial applications can achieve what classified military equipment could barely manage in the early 1990s. The question this raises is a practical one. How does a secret this large stay secret this long? The cynical answer is that most people are not looking. The region near Denali is vast, remote, cold, and inaccessible. The restricted designation is boring enough that it generates no press attention. The monitoring data is esoteric enough that only specialists can read it, and specialists are, as a professional class, generally disinclined to publish findings that would make them look like they have abandoned the norms of their field. The freedom of information system is slow enough and complex enough that most requests simply exhaust the patience of the people making them before they produce anything useful. The more interesting answer is that perhaps the secret does not need active maintenance. Perhaps it has reached a kind of self-sustaining equilibrium in which the sheer strangeness of what is being concealed is itself the best protection. Because how do you report this? How do you stand in front of a scientific conference or a congressional hearing or a press briefing and say, there is a pyramid beneath Alaska, it is bigger than Giza, it has been generating a mathematical signal for as long as we have had instruments to detect it, and we believe it is communicating with similar structures at other points around the globe? You do not say that, not because it is false necessarily, but because the moment you say it, the response consumes you. The ridicule, the scrutiny, the institutional pressure, the professional consequences, the sheer weight of how impossible it sounds pressing down on everything you have spent a career building, and so the signal pulses on. And the mountain keeps its secret, and the world goes about its ordinary business in the ordinary way of worlds that do not yet know what they are sitting on top of. Acit 15. The timeline that doesn't match ours. If you step back from the individual details of this story, the signal, the scans, the classified documents, the drilling failures, the directional beam, the 2012 surge, and look at the whole of it from a distance, what you see is something that is troubling in a very specific way. Everything in this story operates on a timeline that does not correspond to human timescales. Human institutions, even the most durable ones, change over decades. Governments shift, agencies are restructured, personnel turn over, scientific paradigms evolve. The things that seemed certain in one generation become the objects of revision in the next. Nothing in human culture stays the same for a century without significant transformation. This is the nature of civilization. Dynamic, adaptive, impermanent in its specifics, even when it manages continuity in its broad outlines. The structure beneath Denali has been doing the same thing, in the same place, at the same coordinates, producing the same signal, for a period of time that dwarfs anything in human institutional memory. The earliest geological evidence suggests the structure has been there since before recorded history began. The signal Vance detected was not changing. It was not evolving or degrading or shifting its character the way a human technology would after thousands of years of operation. It was doing now what it had apparently been doing at the beginning, pulsing in its mathematical rhythm, aiming its signal at its network of distant points, maintaining whatever function it serves with complete and utter indifference to the human world that had grown up around and above it. This is what separates the Denali structure theory from more conventional conspiracy theories. Most conspiracies are about human actors concealing human things for human reasons. This is something different. This is a conspiracy that, even if the concealment is entirely human, is concealing something that may have nothing to do with humanity at all. Something that preceded us. Something that will outlast us. Something that is running on a schedule so much longer than ours that our entire recorded history might be, from its perspective, a brief afternoon. Consider what 12,000 years actually means. 12,000 years ago there were no cities on Earth, no writing systems, no agriculture in any meaningful, organised sense. Human beings were still hunter-gatherers, moving through landscapes that looked very different from the ones they inhabit today. The Sahara, which is now among the driest and most inhospitable places on the planet, was a savanna, green and wet and full of life. The coastlines of every continent were shaped differently, because sea levels were lower, because so much water was still locked in glaciers that have since melted. The world was a different world, and in that world, that Ice Age world of migrating herds and retreating glaciers and coastlines that modern maps would not recognise, something built a pyramid beneath what would eventually become Alaska. Something designed it with a geometry so precise that our instruments, measuring it through hundreds of feet of intervening rock 12,000 years later, still cannot find the error in its angles. Something installed within it whatever mechanism produces the signal that is still pulsing right now as you listen to this. Something aimed that signal at specific points on a globe that the something presumably understood. A globe that human beings would not achieve a complete picture of for another 11,500 years. Whatever built the Denali structure understood the shape of the Earth before we did. It understood mathematics before we named it. It understood the technology of signal transmission and directional communication while we were still carving tools from stone. And it built something intended to last, not for decades, not for centuries, but apparently for geological timescales, for the kind of duration that makes human civilization look like a footnote. And still it pulses. Still the mountain breathes on its schedule. Still the signal reaches outward across the surface of the world to touch whatever it has always been touching, doing whatever it has always been doing in the cold and dark beneath the Alaskan ice. Epilogue. The mountain below. Today, the region near Denali remains what it has been for decades, restricted, monitored, and officially unremarkable. Hikers who venture into the wilderness surrounding the mountain see what has always been there, the vast, indifferent beauty of a landscape that does not need human witnesses to be extraordinary. The sky above it is sometimes so clear and so dark that the stars seem close enough to touch. The silence in that place is the kind of silence that has mass, that you can feel pressing against you, that makes the ordinary noise of the human world seem, from inside it, like something from another dimension entirely. Beneath that silence, if the theory is correct, something is still running. Not loudly, not dramatically. With the same patient mathematical rhythm it has maintained for longer than our civilization has existed. A heartbeat in stone and permafrost and whatever material it is made of that our drills could not penetrate and our instruments could not fully identify. A heartbeat aimed at specific points across the face of the earth. A heartbeat that surges occasionally, as though something in the deep machinery of its function requires a moment of heightened activity before settling again into its baseline. It's waiting. There are things in this world, and perhaps beneath it, that are genuinely beyond our current capacity to explain, not because the explanations do not exist, but because we do not yet have the framework to hold them. The history of human understanding is, in many ways, the history of slowly developing frameworks adequate to contain what was always already there. We did not invent gravity. We noticed it, named it, and eventually developed the mathematics to describe it. The stars did not begin existing when we built the first telescope. We simply found a way to see them more clearly. Whatever sits beneath Denali has been there, if it is there, since long before any human telescope or seismograph or ground-penetrating radar existed to notice it. It does not require our attention to function. It does not need our understanding to continue doing whatever it does. It simply is, buried and patient and active and unknowable in the way that truly ancient things are unknowable. Not because they are hiding, but because the depth of what they are exceeds, for now, the depth of what we are able to see. The mountain keeps its secret. The signal continues, and somewhere, in a filing cabinet or a classified server, or the memory of a retired scientist who signed a non-disclosure agreement decades ago, the truth of what was found beneath the Alaskan ice sits waiting for the moment when the right person with the right access finally decides to let it out. Or perhaps that moment has already passed. Perhaps the decision has already been made by someone we will never know in a room we will never see to simply let it remain buried. To let the mountain breathe its quiet, mathematical breath forever. To let whatever is down there continue its ancient work in peace. Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed again, and some things beneath the earth, some signals pulsing in the dark beneath the oldest mountains in North America, perhaps they are better left as questions, as mysteries, as the kind of story that you carry with you into the night and into sleep, and into whatever the mind does when the ordinary world releases its hold. Buried beneath the coldest ground on earth, something is still running. It ran before we arrived. It will run after we are gone. And in the long silence between the pulse and the next pulse, it does not wonder what we think of it. It simply waits, and the mountain breathes, and the night, as always, goes on.